The barrel of the rifle pressed cold against Catherine's temple as Will stepped protectively in front of her swollen belly. "She's carrying stolen blood," the bounty hunter snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "That baby belongs to Marcus Whitmore, and so does she." Catherine's hand trembled as she reached for the hidden deed in her dress, the proof that could save them all or destroy everything she'd built with the man who'd given her sanctuary. Will's jaw clenched as he faced the armed men. "Over my dead body." Catherine Marie Sullivan gripped the leather handle of her worn carpetbag as the stagecoach lurched to a halt, dust swirling through the Montana air like smoke from a dying fire. At 24, she had learned to read danger in the smallest details, the way men looked at her, the length of silences, the sound of footsteps behind her. Today those instincts screamed warnings she forced herself to ignore. Her auburn hair clung to her neck despite being pulled back severely, and sweat beaded along her temples. The 6-month swell of her belly pressed against her faded blue dress, making every movement deliberate and careful. She had traveled 3 weeks to reach this remote homestead, each mile taking her further from the nightmare she'd left behind. The stagecoach driver barely glanced at her as he hefted her bag down. "This is it, miss. Middle of nowhere, just like you wanted." Catherine's green eyes swept the landscape, endless rolling hills dotted with scrub brush, mountains rising like jagged teeth against the sky. Perfect. The more isolated, the safer she would be. A tall man emerged from a modest cabin, his broad shoulders filling out a work shirt that had seen better days. Will Garrett moved with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to hard work and solitude. His dark hair caught the afternoon light, and his weathered face spoke of years under the Montana sun. But when his gaze fell on her rounded belly, his step faltered. Catherine watched his expression shift from expectation to confusion to something that might have been disappointment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had been deliberately vague in her letters, mentioning only her need for a fresh start and a practical arrangement. The pregnancy hadn't seemed worth mentioning when survival was her only concern. "Miss Sullivan?" His voice carried the careful politeness of a man trying to hide his shock. "Yes." She lifted her chin, preparing for rejection. Men rarely wanted complications, and she had become nothing but complications wrapped in desperation. Will studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes, the way her free hand rested protectively over her belly. Whatever had driven her here ran deeper than simple hardship. "I wasn't expecting—" He gestured vaguely at her condition. "I understand if the arrangement no longer suits you." Catherine's words came out steadier than she felt. "I can catch the next stage back to town." The thought terrified her. Town meant questions, records, the possibility of being found. But she wouldn't beg, not anymore. Will considered her for a long moment. His previous mail-order bride arrangement had fallen through when the woman decided ranch life was too harsh. He needed help with the homestead, someone to share the endless work and brutal winters. This wasn't what he had planned, but something in Catherine's posture, proud despite obvious fear, stirred his protective instincts. "The baby's father?" he asked quietly. Catherine's jaw tightened. "Dead. An accident." The lie came easily now, practiced during sleepless nights on the journey west. Will nodded slowly. A widow with child wasn't ideal, but desperation made men flexible, and something about her careful dignity appealed to him more than he cared to admit. "Well then," he said, reaching for her carpetbag, "we'd better get you settled before dark." Relief flooded through Catherine so suddenly her knees nearly buckled. She had found sanctuary, at least for now. The remote location, Will's apparent decency, the absence of prying neighbors, it was more than she had dared hope for. As they walked toward the cabin, Catherine allowed herself a moment of genuine hope. Here, surrounded by endless sky and protected by distance, she might finally be safe. She had no way of knowing that 300 miles away, Marcus Whitmore was already organizing the search that would bring armed men to this peaceful valley, or that the papers hidden in her dress would soon make this quiet homestead the center of a deadly confrontation. 3 days passed like careful dance steps between strangers. Catherine woke each morning to the sound of Will chopping wood outside, the rhythmic thunking becoming as familiar as her own heartbeat. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, touching surfaces lightly, afraid to claim too much space in a life that wasn't truly hers. Will watched her from the corner of his eye as she swept the floors and organized his sparse belongings with military precision. Everything about her movements spoke of someone accustomed to walking on eggshells. When he entered a room, she would freeze momentarily, as if bracing for impact that never came. "You don't have to ask permission to sit down," he said on the fourth morning, finding her standing beside the kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. Catherine startled, nearly spilling the coffee. "I wasn't—" "You were." His voice held no judgment, only observation. "This is your home now, too." The word home hit her like a physical blow. She hadn't had a home since her father died 2 years ago. Marcus's house had been a prison dressed up with expensive furniture and locked doors. That afternoon, Will began building something in the barn. The sound of hammering drew Catherine outside, where she found him constructing a wooden cradle. His hands moved with surprising gentleness as he sanded, the rough edges smooth. "You don't have to do that," she said softly. Will glanced up, sawdust dusting his dark hair. "Baby needs somewhere to sleep." The simple practicality of his words made her throat tighten. When had anyone last done something kind for her without expecting payment in return? "I can pay you," she said quickly. "For materials, for your time, Catherine." Will set down his tools and looked at her directly. "We're partners in this. Partners don't nickel and dime each other. Partners, not master and servant, not owner and possession." The concept felt foreign and precious. During their evening meals, Will began drawing stories out of her carefully. Not about her past, he seemed to sense those waters were too dangerous, but about her preferences, her thoughts on small things. Did she prefer coffee or tea? What did she think of the Montana weather? Had she ever seen mountains this tall before? Catherine answered cautiously at first, unused to her opinions mattering, but Will listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that made her feel heard rather than interrogated. "I always wanted to see the ocean," she admitted one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple. "Long way from the ocean out here," Will observed. "I know, but there's something about all this space." She gestured at the endless landscape. "It feels like freedom." Will studied her profile in the fading light. Freedom from what? He wondered, but didn't ask. Some secrets revealed themselves in their own time. The peace shattered on a Tuesday morning when Will returned from checking the cattle with lines of worry etched deep around his eyes. "Someone's been watching the place," he said without preamble. Catherine's coffee mug slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the kitchen floor. The sound made her flinch violently, as if expecting punishment for the accident. "Where?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Ridgeline to the east, horse tracks," but whoever it was stayed well back. Will knelt to clean up the broken ceramic, noting how Catherine's hands shook. "You want to tell me what we're dealing with?" The "we" wasn't lost on her. Even faced with unknown danger, Will wasn't pushing her away. Catherine sank into a chair, her hand instinctively protective over her belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her distress. "I may have overstated how alone I am in this world." Will continued cleaning up the mess, giving her time to find words. "Meaning, my husband isn't dead." The confession tore out of her like a physical wound. "I ran away from him, and he doesn't like losing things he considers his property." Will's hands stilled on the broken pieces. Property. The word explained so much about her careful movements, her constant vigilance, her surprise at basic kindness. "The baby?" he asked quietly. Catherine's face crumpled. "He thinks it's his, but it's not. It can't be. She couldn't finish the sentence, but Will understood. Rage filled Will's chest, hot and protective. He forced his voice to remain calm. "What's his name?" "Marcus Whitmore." Catherine watched Will's face for recognition, for the fear that name should inspire. Marcus owned half of Chicago, had judges in his pocket and politicians at his dinner table. When he wanted something, he usually got it. Will had never heard of Marcus Whitmore, which might have been funny under different circumstances. Out here, Chicago money and influence meant about as much as yesterday's newspaper. "Well then," Will said, standing and brushing off his hands, "we'd better make some preparations." Over the next week, Will transformed the homestead into something resembling a fortress. He moved their sleeping arrangements to the center of the cabin, where walls provided more protection. He cleaned and oiled his rifle, checking ammunition supplies. He established signals with his nearest neighbor, old Pete Morrison, 5 miles south. Catherine worked beside him, her natural intelligence adapting quickly to their new reality. She learned to load the pistol Will gave her, though her hands trembled the first few times she held it. "I never wanted to bring danger to your door," she said one evening as they reinforced the window shutters. "Danger was already at my door," Will replied. "Loneliness is its own kind of threat out here. At least now I've got something worth protecting." The words hung in the air between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Catherine felt something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. Not gratitude, which she was accustomed to, but something deeper and more dangerous. That night, lying in her narrow bed, listening to Will's steady breathing across the room, Catherine allowed herself to imagine a different life. One where the baby growing inside her would have a father who built cradles instead of cages. Where she could speak her mind without calculating the cost. Where partnership meant exactly what Will seemed to think it meant. But imagination was a luxury she couldn't afford. Because 3 days later, the lookout signals Pete Morrison had taught them began flashing from the southern ridge. 3 riders approaching fast, and they weren't friendly neighbors coming to call. Catherine's past had finally caught up to their careful sanctuary, bringing with it the violence she had traveled so far to escape. As she watched Will check his rifle and take position by the window, she realized that running had been the easy part. Now came the reckoning. Catherine's pulse thundered as she watched the 3 riders crest the hill, their dark silhouettes cutting against the afternoon sky like vultures circling wounded prey. Will positioned himself at the window, rifle ready, his jaw set in grim determination. "Stay back from the windows," he murmured, but Catherine was already moving, her hand instinctively reaching for the hidden pocket sewn into her dress, where the folded papers lay pressed against her hip, the deed that had cost her everything and might yet save her life. The riders approached with calculated slowness, letting their presence sink in. The lead man sat tall in his saddle, a silver badge glinting on his chest. Professional bounty hunters, not the rough thugs Marcus usually employed. That meant they were dangerous in ways that went beyond simple violence. Will stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "That's close enough, gentlemen." The lead rider, a lean man with cold gray eyes, smiled without warmth. "Will Garrett, I presume. We're looking for a woman. Goes by Catherine Sullivan, though that might not be her real name. Pregnant auburn hair, green eyes. Ring any bells?" Catherine pressed herself against the kitchen wall, her breath coming in short gasps. They had found her. After 3 weeks of safety, of daring to hope, Marcus's reach had stretched across half the country to drag her back into hell. "Can't say it does," Will replied evenly. "What's your business with this woman?" The bounty hunter's smile widened. "She's wanted for theft, substantial reward for her return, no questions asked." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Of course, harboring a fugitive carries its own penalties." Through the window, Catherine could see Will's knuckles whiten on his rifle. She knew he was calculating odds, weighing options. 3 armed men against 1, with a pregnant woman to protect. The mathematics were brutally simple. "What did she supposedly steal?" Will asked. "Family heirlooms, jewelry, legal documents." The bounty hunter's voice carried practiced authority. "Her husband's been beside himself with worry. Marcus Whitmore's offering $5,000 for her safe return." The sum hung in the air like a physical weight. $5,000 was more money than most Montana ranchers saw in 5 years. Catherine closed her eyes, waiting for Will's resolve to crumble under the crushing reality of that number. Instead, she heard his voice, steady and unmoved. "Well, she's not here. You boys might want to try the next county over." The bounty hunter's expression hardened. "See, that's interesting, because we tracked her stage to this exact spot." Driver remembered her real clear. Pregnant woman traveling alone, paid in cash, asked specifically for the most remote stop on his route. He leaned forward in his saddle. "Now, why would you lie to us, Mr. Garrett?" Catherine's hand tightened on the papers in her dress. The original deed to her father's estate, signed and witnessed, proving her legal ownership of lands and investments worth 50 times what Marcus was offering these men. Her inheritance, stolen through forged documents and murder, then reclaimed in a desperate midnight flight from the Chicago mansion that had been her prison. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears as she stepped away from the wall. Through the window, she watched Will's stance shift slightly, preparing for violence. He would die protecting her, she realized. This good man who had shown her kindness without expecting payment would sacrifice his life for someone he barely knew. The thought galvanized her into action. "I'm here," she called out, moving toward the door despite Will's sharp look of protest. "Don't hurt him. This doesn't concern him." Catherine stepped onto the porch, her chin raised despite the terror coursing through her veins. The lead bounty hunter's eyes lit with predatory satisfaction as he took in her appearance, mentally calculating his payday. "There she is," he drawled. "Catherine Whitmore. Though I hear you've been calling yourself Sullivan. Your husband's been worried sick." The casual cruelty in his voice made her stomach churn, but Catherine forced her expression to remain calm. These men had no idea what they were really dealing with. Catherine drew the folded papers from her dress, her hands steadier than she had expected. The deed crackled softly in the mountain air, and she watched the bounty hunter's eyes narrow as he tried to make sense of what she held. "You want to know what I stole?" Catherine's voice carried across the yard with newfound strength. "I took back what was mine. This deed proves my father's estate belongs to me, not to the man who murdered him and forged documents to steal my inheritance." The lead bounty hunter's confident expression faltered slightly. Legal complications weren't part of his usual job description. "Marcus Whitmore killed my father and forced me into marriage to legitimize his claim to my family's wealth," Catherine continued. "Everything he owns rightfully belongs to me. This deed proves it." Will stepped closer to her side, his rifle still ready. "Sounds like the real thief is the one paying your wages." The bounty hunter's horse shifted nervously as seconds stretched into eternity. Catherine could see him calculating new odds, weighing the certainty of Marcus's payment against potential legal troubles. "I'll pay you $10,000 to escort me to the territorial courthouse instead," Catherine said quietly. "Twice what Marcus offered, and you'll be on the right side of the law." The three men exchanged glances. $10,000 from stolen inheritance meant more than $5,000 from a potentially fraudulent claim. The mathematics had shifted dramatically in Catherine's favor. "How do we know you're good for it?" the second rider asked. Catherine smiled, feeling truly powerful for the first time in years. "Because unlike Marcus, I actually own what I'm offering to pay with." After a tense negotiation, the bounty hunters agreed to testify against Marcus in exchange for Catherine's payment. They departed with promises to return with federal marshals and legal documents that would finally end her nightmare. Will watched them disappear over the ridge before turning to Catherine. "So you're wealthy?" "Yes." She studied his face, afraid of what she might find there. "Will you stay?" His question was simple, direct. Catherine looked at the cradle visible through the cabin door, at the man who had chosen protection over profit, at the endless Montana sky that had become her definition of freedom. "I'll stay," she said, "not because I have to, but because I want to." Will's smile was worth more than all her father's inheritance combined.